talk to people in Indonesia or people in Malaysia, people in Thailand, they tend to view the rise of Chinese power in historical terms, that China has been powerful before and then it ceased to be powerful and it will be powerful again. And so it's almost a pragmatic understanding of how power works.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Good afternoon and welcome to our 7th Afternoon Light Live for 2026. For much of our post-Federation history, Australians have grappled with a recurring fear of abandonment. As a former British colony occupying a vast island continent between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, our strategic circumstances have often felt overwhelming. Throughout our history, Australians have looked to distant great powers for our security. Debates about Australia's place in the world have centred, of course, on Britain, America, and the alliances that have helped secure our nation from the threat of fascism, communism, and Islamism. Indeed, even Robert Menzies warned during the Second World War against viewing the world in watertight compartments and argued that Australia's security could not be separated from the wider region and the wider world. In the current century, the 21st century, these debates, of course, have focused on the rise of China and how Australia should respond to a changing balance of power in our region. Some question whether prioritising the US alliance is still in our interests 75 years since its signing this year, and have encouraged us to look to build strategic partnerships with countries closer to home. Home to almost 700 million people, some of the world's fastest growing economies, and an increasingly influential voice in global affairs, Southeast Asia sits right on Australia's doorstep. Yet, Australians often know remarkably little about our nearest neighbours. We speak too few of their languages, we study too little of their history and their politics, and we too often view the region through the prism of great power rivalry, rather than on its own terms. Well, joining me today to discuss Blind Spot, Southeast Asia and Australia's future is Michael Wesley, Professor of International Relations and Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Melbourne. As always, with our Afternoon Light Lives, Michael and I will talk for 30 minutes before throwing to you our audience. But without further ado, Michael Wesley, welcome for a second time to Afternoon Light,
Thank
but
you.
The first time in the live setting. Michael, I've loved reading your provocative quarterly essay. I am an orthodox thinker on foreign policy and Australia's place in the world, so it was incredibly challenging for me, as I'm sure you're not surprised to hear. I'm a former DFAT officer and very much the hawkish on China school, and it's, I think, a really important contribution to our national discourse on these really important issues at a critically important time. Let's start by you explaining your blind spot thesis.
So look, I sort of began by thinking about how Australia, really since Federation or even before Federation, has engaged with the world. And there are a number of patterns that are quite interesting to me. One is that we are a smaller power, but we tend to think like a great power in that we think that Australia's vital interest is in how the world works in general. And one of the key things that you observe about Australian foreign policy and strategic engagement is how often our troops are sent abroad, going back to the 1880s, to fight in conflicts that are a long way from Australia's shores. And so it really makes you think, well, why? Why is that the case? And particularly since that is a tension with what I argue in the quarterly essay is one of the original geopolitical insights of the Australian colonies, and you can trace this back into the 1840s, and that is to be worried about which countries controlled the islands around Australia. And so you can go back into the 1840s and find thunderous editorials and even demonstrations in Sydney and other cities about the British government allowing what were then seen to be hostile interests lodge themselves in the islands to our north and northeast. And so I think the quarterly essay came out of an enduring fascination with these two seemingly at tension tendencies of Australian foreign policy that have manifested themselves for almost 200 years. And so thinking through that and what that means in an age where I think we are now seeing a transition in order, not only a transition away from a unipolar America-centred and America-guaranteed order towards something else. I hesitate at this stage to call it a multipolar order because I'm not sure it is yet. But we are transitioning out of an order in which we could be relatively comfortable with how the world worked into an era in which we really don't know how the world will work in the future. And therefore, should we be going back to that original geopolitical insight, and that is to think about, well, surely Australia's immediate security and immediate position in the world should be secured by thinking hardest and working hardest on our immediate maritime approaches and the islands that comprise them.
And of course, the focus is really Southeast Asia in your essay, not the Pacific Islands so much, which, I mean, makes a lot of sense because of the economic strength, cultural strength and military strength and strategic influence of those islands. But we do see the Pacific being quite a feature of China's diplomacy and strategic ambitions as well.
Yep.
I'm interested, though, in your framing, especially of pre-Federation era, and something I wondered was maybe you didn't mention so much is that Australia, of course, at that time conceived of itself, and in really up until World War II, as part of the British Empire. And you critique sending our troops to battlegrounds far, far from the Australian landmass. But when you're part of a greater imperial structure, well, that's just part of the greater imperial effort to defend the empire. And I wondered if some of your analysis was a bit 2026 perspective, maybe missing the circumstances of the empire and how we didn't view ourselves as Australians. In fact, Australian citizen didn't, as a concept, legal concept, exist until 1948. So this idea we were British subjects, part of the British Empire, and defending the empire was quite natural for us.
Yeah, that was certainly the dominant trend in Australian thinking, but it wasn't an uncontested trend. I think Australian elites saw themselves on both sides of politics. You know, we think a lot about Menzies as the arch empire thinker, but Curtin was a very strong empire loyalist as well.
Sure.
And this is a bipartisan tendency in Australian politics, but there were always tensions there. And so, again, pre-Federation, you know, the great Australian historian Neville Maney from Sydney University actually said that some of the strongest drivers of driving the Australian colonies towards federation were geopolitical drivers. And it was because, quite frankly, the Australian colonies were alarmed and angry at London for not taking who was in charge of the islands around Australia seriously enough. And so while we were empire loyalists, we worried that the empire wasn't taking us seriously enough. That was a driver of federation, and soon after that, the creation of the Royal Australian Navy against the express wishes of Whitehall. Whitehall did not want us to form a navy because it thought it would divide imperial power. Then later on, and I'll stop here, after the First World War, there was a very strong climate of opinion, including at this university, that saw the empire as an outdated way of ordering world politics, and the new way of doing it was multilateralism. And so this very strong movement in Australia favouring the League of Nations as a better way of ordering world politics, and of course, institutions like the Australian Institute of International Affairs came out of that. So I would defend myself. I think this is a time to think about Australia and its role in the world, but I do think there has been a tension between, let's call it, the empire-mindedness of Australians and the alternatives to empire-mindedness.
Of course, it all comes crashing down in 1942 with the fall of Singapore. I wonder in what ways does the Australia's American alliance echo that overcommitment we had in this Singapore strategy. I mean, we obviously were very concerned in the lead up to 42 that we needed to bring our troops home, and we weren't sure that that it was going to hold, and of course we were proved right. But there was this sort of sense that Britain could hold the empire and the threats to the empire at bay from having a very significant naval presence in Singapore. And is there a sense that we're over-investing with the American alliance in that respect as well? Are there...
So, academics come up with phrases in an attempt to become famous. So, I mean, I do argue that Australia has this tendency because, since European settlement of Australia, we have been close allies of the most powerful maritime English-speaking nation on earth, first the British and then the Americans. We have a tendency to adopt the primacy of our major ally as a core Australian foreign policy interest. And I think that explains better than any the willingness of us to invest blood and treasure in helping our major ally try and maintain its global primacy. That's why Australian troops went to Sudan in the 1880s. That's why they went to South Africa at the turn of the 20th century. That's why they, went to Europe in the First World War and so on. So I think there is that tendency to do things. And one of the things I argue in the essay is that it is a tendency, therefore, to ignore what's happening in our near region in order to invest in our great power allies' global supremacy. That might have made sense in the past. I think it makes a lot less sense in 2026 and going forward.
Of course, in the 50s, at the beginning of the Cold War, the threat of the spread of global communism through to Southeast Asia was a major concern of the Australian government. And in fact, Australia's planners identified Southeast Asia and it's as a security threat, basically Indonesia, as one of our top priorities. But I mean, you basically argued it just never happened, though. There was a sort of failure to launch there. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think at a time when Southeast Asia did become dangerous, Australia did very successfully focus its attention on Southeast Asia. And again, this is a Menzies era observation. Decolonisation was a big shock to Australia. It was a regional order-changing event, and Australians genuinely didn't know what these newly independent countries to our north would turn out to be. And so I think we had three great fears in the 1940s and 1950s. Japanese militarism, or the resurgence of Japanese militarism, certainly communism, but also the idea of this aggressive nationalism in Asia. And for a while it manifested itself in Indonesia with President Sukarno. And Sukarno was a genuinely worrying figure for Australia because he was someone who projected back to the great empires that had predated the Dutch in Indonesia. He was an advocate of Indonesia Raya, the Greater Indonesia. He opposed Malaysia and Singapore as independent countries. He was militarily aggressive and he was aligning with Hanoi, Beijing, Pyongyang. And so this was genuinely shocking for Australia. And if you read those strategic planning documents of the early 1950s, you can see the concern there. And I would argue that this was a period in which Australia did invest heavily. It was probably the most heavily invested we'd been because we invested in helping countries like Malaysia form themselves as states. And you had some of the great Australian diplomats like Tom Critchley, who would often be invited into Malaysian cabinet meetings, to provide an Australian perspective on what was going on there. And it also gave rise to what became the Defence of Australia doctrine because, those strategic basis papers actually baldly state if Australia gets into conflict in Southeast Asia, we cannot depend on the United States helping us out. And that evolved into the Defence of Australia doctrine, I would argue. So I think Australia's interest and attention has waxed and waned over time, and it's just at a stage of having waned remarkably at the moment.
And I think it's an important thing to remember too, in 1963 with Konfrontasi with Indonesia, with Sukarno's Indonesia, when Australia and Britain were involved in trying to stop Indonesia taking what would become Malaysian territory, that the United States under President Kennedy actually said, don't think the ANZUS is going to apply when it comes to Indonesia.
Indeed.
So, Australia in the 60s, and I would argue has always put its own interests first, but it realises the alliance with the United States is a quid pro quo. If, in order to receive the benefits of the American security umbrella, we need to contribute something. But sometimes our interests are not going to align. And on Indonesia in the 60s, they did not. The Americans saw it as the great economic interests in Indonesia and didn't want to create a conflict there. Same with Suez as well, of course. Our interests did not align at all. And some argue that the lessons from Suez should be much more reflected on today than they are being, that allowing a great power to fail in the Middle East led to the decline of British preeminence. And are we once again seeing the same thing happen in the Middle East with the United States? Something I want to put to you, do you think that Robert Menzies' position on foreign policy during the 50s and 60s is actually quite close to what you're arguing? And I'll explain this, because he thought Australia could deepen its alliance with the United States, but at the same time invest heavily in our region. And he did that, of course, through Colombo Plan, engagement with Malaya, as I've said, with Singapore. And I don't think it gets enough credit, but the Colombo Plan and what it did, bringing international students to Australia from the region, you have generations of Southeast Asians now in their later stage of life who've been leaders who were educated by our country. But our international aid was going all to that region. At the same time, we saw ourselves as strongly allied to the United States and, of course, supporting the global fight against communism through that era, first in Korea and then, of course, in Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the distinction I make in the essay is between governments that treat the US alliance as an end of our foreign policy and those that treat the US alliance as a means of our foreign policy. And I would put Menzies in the latter category. I think Menzies was pretty clear-eyed about the American alliance. He was never a great, all in with the US sort of thinker or leader.
Oh, he said it was built on a foundation of jelly, the alliance. So.
There you go. Great quote. And I think the other Prime Minister who stands out as having a very clear-eyed and hard-headed view of the alliance was Bob Hawke. A little-known fact is when the Hawke government was running for election in 1983, one of the planks that they had, probably to appease the left wing of the Labor Party, was we will review the ANZUS alliance if we are elected. And when they won office, they did. They reviewed the ANZUS alliance. Now, can you imagine a government of either side in Australia today calling on a public review of the ANZUS alliance? And it shows just how far we've gone, and this is bipartisan, towards treating the ANZUS alliance as an end of our foreign policy, in that we do stuff just to preserve the ANZUS alliance. And that is, I think, a very dangerous place for us to be in. I am by no means an advocate of ending the US alliance. I think we get enormous benefits from the US alliance. What we need to do is clear up our thinking about what the US alliance is for and where is the US alliance in Australia's national interest, and to emphasise that and start becoming a bit less sentimental about it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say on the Hawke review of the alliance that there was a really important set of circumstances in which he called for that. I mean, New Zealand withdrew from ANZUS, so there was a big debate, of course. He was also inheriting the sort of ghost of Whitlam. I mean, Whitlam had almost ended the alliance, and Nixon's advisors at one stage started to say, well, we're not sure actually if we want to have these intelligence bases in Australia. We're very unsure about Whitlam's reliability. So, Hawke had to really resuscitate the alliance in terms of being a Labor Prime Minister, the next Labor Prime Minister after Whitlam. So, I mean, I would say, was he brave or just responding to the circumstances of the time? I probably hasten to...
I wouldn't say it was brave, but it was just something that could be done. It could be contemplated at the time. It wasn't something that prevented Hawke being elected as Prime Minister. I think if you had any side of politics say, as part of their platform, we're going to review the ANZUS alliance, remembering, the Latham election in 2004. I think it would be something that would be seen as, Sir Humphrey would say, politically courageous in Australia.
Well, we're in an era of potentially a multi-party system, and last poll I looked at, the Liberal Party wasn't much ahead of the Greens, and I think the Greens would probably be quite open to a review of the alliance.
True.
So you never know, Michael.
True.
You might just get more political courage, whether it's politically wise or not. I think you know where I stand. Since you wrote your essay, of course, the United States has, with Israel, attacked Iran, and apparently that's all finished now. So, may the tankers cruise through the Straits of Hormuz and return oil and fertiliser and the rest to the global markets. But it's a stark reminder, of course, of the importance of the waterways to our north through Southeast Asia, Straits of Malacca, of course, being the important one. I think 70% of Australia's trade flows through those waters. I mean, what do you think the lessons are from the latest conflict in the Middle East for Australia when we think about what might happen if there were to be some sort of contestation between China and the US? I mean, that's the most likely one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether we'll learn the lessons of this, but again, to go back to what I wrote in the essay, Australia geopolitically is difficult to invade but easy to coerce.
Yeah.
And it's because we are so dependent on maritime trade that goes through an archipelago of islands, and it means that a hostile power with sufficient naval capability would be able to stop or interdict most of the trade into Australia and out of Australia, may I say. And, what the crisis in the Middle East has shown is just how dependent Australia is on energy imports and fertiliser imports. I think one of the interesting kind of diplomatic outcomes of what's happened was the shuttle diplomacy that Albanese did in Southeast Asia around energy. And it really, I think, illustrated for Australians the mutual energy dependency between ourselves and many of the countries in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. Not only does Australia rely on the petroleum they send us, they refine and send us, but they rely on the gas that we send them. And so hopefully there's someone somewhere in DFAT working hard on, okay, what are the bigger picture possibilities and implications of this? Because I think they're potentially profound.
I was reading in the paper, I think it was yesterday, about the industrial action at Impex's gas facility in, and I'm going to get it, is it WA or Northern Territory? Northern Territory,
yeah.
Thank you. And it did just remind me, of course, and that's a Japanese-owned facility, but it did remind me of the industrial action we had in World War II, where we were wanting to keep industry going, and yet the unions and the national interest were parting ways in terms of their views on how to handle the crisis. And if you're, Japanese-owned company relying on the arrangements you've had with Australia, the investments you've made in Australia, the appeals the Australian Prime Minister has made to keep things moving, and then the union movement sees things another way, sees an opportunity, then how does Australia get through those sorts of challenges? We'll see in coming days.
Yeah.
We were the target of China's economic coercion in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, people would be familiar. Our foreign minister called for a international inquiry into the causes of COVID, and obviously starting in China, that was the causes of COVID in China. And the Chinese government did not take kindly to that. Yep. And there's been criticism that Australia handled that in a ham-fisted way. But the reality was we received billions of dollars of economic coercion, I mean trillions probably, into Australia, blocking of coal exports to China, lobster, wine, barley, I mean you name it. Southeast Asia looked at us and thought that was a strange way of dealing with things. What is it about Southeast Asia that leads it to react very differently to China's economic pressure? It doesn't criticise human rights abuses in Xinjiang. It's a lot more reticent to push back.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's something that I explored in my Menzies lecture in London in late April, that I think that we need to get a lot more familiar with how differently we tend to see the way the world works and the way that our neighbours see the way the world works. And I'll give you one example. Australians tend to have a very moral view of power.
Mm-hmm.
So power matters because of who holds power. If the most powerful country in the world is a country that we regard as a morally virtuous country, then power is a very good thing. But if power is held by a country that we see as not morally virtuous, then power is a bad thing. And that is the way we tend to currently view the decline of American power and the rise of Chinese power. We see it through a moral lens. And one of the things I argued in London was that Southeast Asians tend not to view the holding of power as a moral thing. Power, I would argue, is just an aspect of the world that we have to live with. And so who wields power is not as significant if you're in Southeast Asia. And so I think they've got a much less values-driven way of understanding the decline of American power and the rise of Chinese power. Power is power. You've just got to deal with whichever country wields it. I also think that there's quite a significant element of historical memory. If you talk to people in Indonesia or people in Malaysia, people in Thailand, they tend to view the rise of Chinese power in historical terms, that China has been powerful before and then it ceased to be powerful and it will be powerful again. And so it's almost a pragmatic understanding of how power works. And so I would argue that one of the things that has kind of created a bigger gulf between ourselves and the governments of Southeast Asia is their inability to understand how we are dealing with the rise of Chinese power, that we seem to be, excessively morally driven about it and not pragmatic enough. And so there were people during that episode of us being under Chinese coercion in Southeast Asia, friends of mine who were saying, what did you expect? You go on television and your foreign minister argues for a public investigation into where COVID came from. What do you expect? So I think we still in Australia have a lot of kind of understanding to build about how we view the world and how our neighbours view the world.
I have so many more questions on that, but we do need to open up to audience questions. I'm going to start with Andy Campbell's question. Thanks, Andy. Did the process of writing your quarterly essay or the subsequent correspondence exchange in the June edition, I haven't read that yet, I must get to it, cause you to change your mind on any aspects?
Oh, gosh, Andy. I was just saying to Georgina, I think I signed the contract for the quarterly essay in September of last year, and I can genuinely say that by Christmas of last year, I still had no idea what I was going to write. And so it was a process of doing deep reading and deep thinking. And of course, this is a topic that I've thought about for all of my academic career, which is longer than I care to admit. Yes, look, I've developed new ideas and new understandings and new thinking along my journey. The process of promoting it and the wonderful audience questions have further refined those. And I think some of the correspondence that's come out in this quarterly essay currently has certainly made me think hard. Yeah, I'm not very popular with the government at the moment.
No, I was saying to Michael, I did see a government minister rebut your quarterly essay on LinkedIn. So it's always better to be talked about than to be ignored, isn't it?
Indeed.
A question here from Ridvan Kilic. Is it possible for Indonesia to become Australia's top security partner in the Indo-Pacific sometime in the next 2 decades? Wow.
That's a very good question. So first of all, I think that Indonesia and Australia have very different views on what a security partnership is. We have to realise that Indonesia has a very deep-seated tradition of non-alignment. This idea that it would become an exclusive security partner, I think, is something that if we think that, it is deluded to think that. Certainly the government is very proud of the recent security treaty it's signed with Indonesia and quite tellingly, I think, compares it to the 1995, I think it was, agreement on maintaining security that Paul Keating signed with President
But ignores,
Suharto.
of course, the Howard Government Lombok Treaty because you wouldn't want to give credit to the other side of politics.
What I would say is that agreement on maintaining security was repudiated 4 years later over the East Timor crisis. So it shows how shallow that understanding was and that treaty was. So my sense is that if Australia drastically lowers its expectations of what a security partnership is, which arguably is not possible for us in terms of our strategic culture, if we did, then possibly. But I think, again, that impulse in Australia, that self-deterring impulse, which is a wonderful phrase that is not mine, unfortunately, but I'm going to claim it, of Australians continually thinking that we are not able to defend ourselves and therefore we need a bigger partner and we need other partners. That is going to be there. That is deeply embedded in the Australian psyche, in my sense. And so I think we are going to try and preserve the American alliance for as long as we can, which means it will be very hard for us to develop a genuinely meaningful security agreement with Indonesia.
A question here from Gary. What is the extent of Chinese influence within Southeast Asia? You mentioned security threats from Southeast Asia in the 60s. Are there any threats that still exist?
So I think China has substantial influence in Southeast Asia. I think it has so many advantages in Southeast Asia. It is far and away the most important trading and investment partner in Southeast Asia. An interesting figure that came up in my research is that 70% of people of Chinese heritage who live outside of China are in Southeast Asia. 70%. It's extraordinary. It shows the historic ties and historic migration patterns into Southeast Asia. Many of the business networks, the commercial networks are all ethnic Chinese, and they are parts of Chinese influence. There is also, China has been the big kind of entrepreneur of diplomatic initiatives in Southeast Asia, with no question, for the past 25 years. And those agreements, security agreements, economic agreements, infrastructure agreements, have real influence and capability. The one thing that stops me saying China has won in Southeast Asia is public opinion. And so there's a really interesting institute in Singapore called the Yusof Ishak Institute, and it does opinion polling in Southeast Asia every year. And what it has shown is that confidence in American power has been shrinking over time, and it's consistently shrinking. Perceptions of the growth of Chinese power have been consistently growing, but trust in China as an international partner has been falling. So while there's a perception in many Southeast Asian societies that China is the overwhelmingly powerful country in Southeast Asia, there is deep distrust on how China will use that power.
A question here from Professor Tim Lynch, who's in our live audience.
He's a terrible man.
Rather than comparing today's environment to the Cold War, is this right, Tim? Odd Arne Westat in his new book draws chilling parallels to the period just before World War I, an era marked by multipolarity, imperial overstretch, rising nationalism and fractured globalisation. Is he right? How should Australia change its foreign policy if he is?
Goodness me. Well, I look forward to the review of that book in this weekend's review, Tim, as I do every review you write. Look, I'm a little bit hamstrung because I haven't read that book, although it is on my hit list once I get through the 600 pages of Paul Kelly's book. Look, it's an interesting idea and set of ideas. Australia at the turn of the century was in an interesting strategic place. You had people like Alfred Deakin who genuinely were empire loyalists, but genuinely saw that Australia had things to do in its own region as well. That's why we needed the Royal Australian Navy. That's why we needed to think about who was in control of the islands around us. That's why quite frankly, Deakin invited the Great White Fleet to come to Australia because it was Australia's psychological comfort that there was another great Anglo-Saxon power that we might be able to turn to. And by the way, the history of Australians identifying with the United States and thinking we had strategic common cause with the United States goes well back into the 19th century, including, using the phrase like Australia's manifest destiny in the Pacific, the need to create a Monroe Doctrine in the Pacific. So, Tim, I'll have to come back to you on that one, but it's an interesting set of ideas.
I'm going to take the host prerogative here because there was another gotcha question I had for you today, and I have to ask it. It's just reminded me. Pauline Hanson just delivered her first National Press Club address today, and as I was reading about it just before we came online, I was interested to see that, because I was interested in her foreign policy announcement. So she had one on aid. She said that if a Hanson government was elected, that they would still continue Australia's aid commitments where it was going to make a real difference. But if a country received Chinese aid, it would not receive Australian aid, which is, that's... Anyway, what are your views? I have lots of views.
Well, it would probably mean that we'd stop giving aid to all of the countries in our own region.
Yeah.
Because all of them receive some form of Chinese aid. And so it's an interesting idea, Pauline, but I'm not sure it would have Australia's national interest at the core of it.
Yeah. Maybe another one where the Southeast Asian countries would turn their heads. The next question I have is, what are the similarities and differences between Australia's strategic relationship with South Asia and that of Southeast Asia?
Gosh, what a good question. So South Asia is a big and complex region and obviously dominated by India, by far the biggest dog on the block there. And our history of relations with India are a complex history, and Menzies' own history and his relationship with Nehru is a complex history. I think I would actually say that the history of our relations with India is probably a bit closer to the history of our relations with North Asia, in that India is seen, I think, by large parts of Australia as the next great Asian partner for Australia, as Japan was back in the 1950s, as Korea, Taiwan, and China certainly in the 90s and 2000s were. I tend to think of them as sort of influences that dragged Australia's strategic vision up and over Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And I would tend to see our relationship with India as one of those. Certainly India is an important relationship. I think we pay less attention to the other countries of South Asia. Occasionally Pakistan gets on the radar. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, forget about it. So I think I would see it less akin to Southeast Asia, more akin to Northeast Asia.
Yeah, and I think we've got to recognise now the largest immigrant group to Australia comes from India. So the diaspora here is going to have, in the future, huge influence on, civic society, on political life, economic life, cultural life. So there will be I think a natural pull for Australia to consider India much more strongly. But it certainly hasn't. I should say, we've got Lisa Singh here, the head of the Australia-India Institute. So wonderful to have that interest. I think this is always an interesting question. Do Southeast Asians see Australia as an Asian country, a Western country, or something in between?
I would say emphatically a Western country. I would say that Southeast Asians, when they look at Australia, they primarily see us through a US lens. They see Australia as a loyal US ally. And it's very hard as an Australian in Southeast Asia to break out of that kind of framing, if you like. I think that there have been periods when that has been a little bit more nuanced, but I think the last, let's say, 25 years of Australian foreign policy, particularly participating in things like the invasion of Iraq, have solidified the view that Australia is very much a Western country and identifies heavily with the United States and Europe, Britain, Europe and that sort of thing, and less so with countries closer to home.
Do you think that will change inevitably as our cultural mix changes? The number of Australians born overseas, and actually I'm one of them, don't look at it, but
as am I, yeah,
is I think 40% now. We are in the future potentially going to be even greater proportion born overseas and not of the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Irish heritage of the 19th century, early 20th century.
So this is a question that intrigues me. So I'm half Indian. I was born in India and emigrated to Australia when I was 4. It's an open question to me as to whether Australia's ethnic composition will have an effect on how this country orients itself to the world. It could be a great podcast topic, and Lisa has done a lot of thinking about this as well. I'm not sure. We've had now, 50 years of large-scale migration from Asia. Has Australia changed over time in terms of the way we look at the world? I don't think it really has. And we haven't really seen, with the exception of people like Lisa, people of Asian descent go in large numbers into our government. So obviously our foreign minister at the moment. But outside of that, our government, the ranks of our parliament are still very Anglo-Celtic.
And the Prime Minister has a pretty Italian-sounding last name.
Has an Italian-sounding name. But, okay, so if not Anglo-Celtic, then Western, And then you look to, I'm blathering now, but then you look to countries like Canada and Britain, which do have a very non-Western tinge to their parliamentary institutions. You look at the current leader of the Conservative Party in Britain. Has it really changed the way that Canada and Britain see themselves in the world? I'm not sure. So there is a real question to be answered here.
Yeah. Another question. AUKUS strengthens Australia's position in Southeast Asia. Agree or disagree?
I would disagree with that. Let me put on record. I think that there are so many questions over AUKUS. The one that's really most talked about is, will we ever get these submarines? I think that is less germane to the question of if and when we get these submarines, will we be able to run them? This is a piece of equipment that is so complex that Britain almost doesn't have the capability. Britain couldn't maintain its submarines without the United States. And it is a bigger country. It's got a bigger industrial base, bigger academic sector, bigger government than Australia. I don't think we have the capabilities of actually maintaining these
It has
things.
civil nuclear too.
It has civil nuclear as well. Anyway, by the by, I think that nuclear-powered submarines are all about conflict a long way from our shores, not conflict close to our shores. And therefore, they are a strategic commitment to Northeast Asia, not Southeast Asia. That's without mentioning the perceptions of Southeast Asians as to why we've got them and what that means for their own security. So an example that I raise in the essay is that Indonesians worry that Australia having nuclear-powered submarines will draw conflict towards Indonesia rather than push it away. And that's why they're really concerned about it.
AUKUS is, of course, much more than the nuclear submarines. Another question here. Which Southeast Asian leader has had the greatest influence on Australia's regional thinking?
Wow. I'd probably say Lee Kuan Yew. I think Lee Kuan Yew was really influential to that period in Australian life in the 1980s when Australia thought that we were falling behind. It's a quote attributed to Lee, although no one can actually find him saying it, that Australia would become the poor white trash of Asia. And of course, everyone remembers Paul Keating's Banana Republic comment and that sense that Australia needed to change its economy and its society in order to keep up. I think that was us channeling Lee Kuan Yew.
Are there any misconceptions Southeast Asians have about Australia?
Oh, plenty. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are a lot of Southeast Asians who have these sort of outdated perceptions of Australia as still, the sort of country that had the White Australia policy, the sort of country that all of its politicians are Pauline Hanson types. But the great benefit and the great wealth that Australia has is that we have been training the elites and educating the elites and leaders of Southeast Asian societies now for close to 80 years. And you mentioned the Colombo Plan, goes all the way back to then. We have literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asians who understand Australia because they've lived here. I tell this story too much, but I'll tell it again. About a couple of months ago, I had a conversation with a very wealthy Chinese-Malaysian property developer who, like me, studied at the University of Queensland in the late 1980s, passionate Brisbane Broncos fan. And so we talked for about, 30 minutes of a 40-minute meeting about the great Brisbane Broncos teams of the late 1980s. There's a trivia question for you. And he's still a member of the Brisbane Broncos Supporters Club. And so that tells you the depth of commitment and the depth of affection that Australia has in Southeast Asia. I just don't think we use it enough, and I don't think we mobilise that enough.
I have a story I often tell. When I was visiting a friend in the High Commission in Malaysia in 2010, say, he was commenting that the entire Malaysian cabinet at that time had studied in Australia. The entire cabinet. I mean, that's pretty powerful.
It's pretty, yeah.
A question here, how can Australia strengthen relations with Southeast Asia without reinforcing perceptions of paternalism or strategic opportunism?
Great question. With great difficulty, we need to start to think of Southeast Asia on its own terms. I think we are currently engaging in Southeast Asia through a China lens. So what we're doing in Southeast Asia is very much about, and I probably fall into this trap in the essay itself, as saying the importance of Southeast Asia to us is because China is becoming powerful. But we've got to start to think about building permanent, lasting relationships in Southeast Asia, irrespective of what's happening in Southeast Asia. I think one of the reasons for our inattention to Southeast Asia is that between 1966 and the fall of Sukarno and probably, 2008 or so, Southeast Asia was benign. There was nothing particularly going on there. And so we didn't really have to spend a lot of time worrying about what was happening. Now that benign order is shifting, China is a big part of that, the United States is a big part of that. It's hopefully going to make us wake up that we need to start to invest in much more enduring ways in the region.
Something you write about in the essay is the Australian-American leadership dialogue. And, I mean, it's pretty powerful private diplomatic initiative, even just thinking about the possibility of something like that between Australia, that's not government-led. I mean, government ministers and opposition representatives attend, but it's got a lot of firepower, at least particularly from the Australian side, a lot of support. Is that type of thing possible, do you think? I mean, would the Southeast Asian countries take us seriously enough that they would send their captains of industry, civil society leaders, government ministers to attend a private diplomatic initiative like that?
I mean, and would we take Southeast Asia seriously enough? Yeah. I think that's the key question. I've been to one back in 2006 and it was regarded then, probably as it's regarded now, as a great, you've probably been to many, and as a great badge of honour, if you like, to be invited along. And the one I went to in Washington, it was, the Americans can turn on the full imperial pomp when they need to. And, these kind of hayseed Australians wandering around. And I shouldn't say that. I think your dad was the one.
That's all
right. And I certainly wouldn't class him as a hayseed. But it was something that if you were invited, you went. If we were to do something like that with Indonesia or Malaysia or even Singapore, I think you would really struggle to get people going along and committing to the time there. So I think on both sides there would be a real question of interest and commitment, which goes to the problem that we're talking about, I think.
We've got 4 minutes left, masses of questions to get through. I love this question. Such a tough one. If China invades Taiwan tomorrow, which it would need a bit of time to build up, so this is definitely a hypothetical. If China invades Taiwan tomorrow, what are the first 3 things you think the Australian government should do? That's why I asked you.
My God.
Just to have that smile on your face.
Well, we haven't got any submarines, so you wouldn't dispatch the submarines.
We've got the Collins class. I think they're all broken.
I think they're all broken. They're all being upgraded.
As Greg Sheridan said a few months ago about Australia sending warships or not to the Strait of Hormuz to the Middle East, well, that would be tantamount to elder abuse.
Very good, very good. So look, on a more serious note, I talk about all of the ways that China can threaten Australia, and I think one of the most imminent ones is that, yes, China can attack Australia. China's military capabilities, particularly its militarised bases in the South China Sea, give it the capacity to attack Australia directly. My question is, why would China directly attack Australia? And the only conceivable scenario I can think of is if it was at war with the United States and it needed to take out US intelligence facilities and US used bases in Australia. So one of the first things the Australian government should do is, how can we protect ourselves from a direct Chinese attack? You would think that there would be missiles coming towards Pine Gap, Tyndall Air Base, HMAS Stirling, and perhaps some other facilities in Australia. So we'd have to think very carefully about that. The second element of our thinking is, to what extent would it be wise for Australia to be involved? I think that Australia would inevitably become involved because of this thinking that the US alliance is an end of our foreign policy and it would end if we didn't support the United States. And so thinking through, how are we going to support the United States? And then the third piece of thinking is longer term, and that is, what does the region look like after a major US-China war? Because this is a major effect. And, the nature of warfare these days is that the United States and China would go after each other's eyes and ears, which means they would attack submarine cables, they would attack outer space satellites. These are all things that would drastically change the world economy and Australia's ability to exist. And so this is a very big set of questions for the Australian government to think about, and whether we can avoid any of those consequences is something that we all should worry about.
Michael Wesley, thank you so much for your time today on Afternoon Light Live. Everyone, please get this essay if you haven't already. It's, as I said, a fantastic contribution to our public discourse. History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.